The date was April 29th, 1945. The island of Okinawa, a jagged ridge of coral and rock rising from the blood-soaked earth like a broken tooth. The Americans called it Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese called it impregnable. For Private First Class Desmond Doss, a young Army medic from Lynchburg, Virginia, it would become the place where everything he believed would be tested in the most brutal crucible imaginable. But to understand what happened on that ridge, you have to go back to a childhood home in the Blue Ridge Mountains, back to a boy who watched his father, a carpenter and a veteran of the First World War, struggle with demons that whiskey couldn't drown, back to a single moment that changed everything. Desmond was 11 years old when he nearly killed his own brother. A fight between siblings, the kind that happens in every household, except this one went too far. Desmond had his hands around his brother's throat. He saw the light fading from his eyes. In that instant, terror gripped him. Not fear of punishment, but fear of what he had almost become. His mother pulled him away, and Desmond made a promise to God that day. He would never take another human life. Ever. That conviction only deepened as he grew. A Seventh-day Adventist, Desmond took the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," as literal truth. Not a suggestion, not a guideline for peacetime. An absolute. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, and America plunged into war, Desmond faced an impossible choice. Every fiber of his being told him to serve his country, but every teaching of his faith told him he could never kill. Most conscientious objectors refused to serve at all. Desmond refused to refuse. He would join the army, but he would not carry a weapon. He would be a medic. He would save lives, not take them. The men of his unit thought he was insane. When Desmond Doss arrived at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, for basic training with the 77th Infantry Division, he was met with contempt, suspicion, and outright hostility. Here was a man who said he'd go into combat but wouldn't carry a rifle, wouldn't even touch one. To the soldiers training to fight the most savage war in human history, this wasn't courage, it was cowardice dressed up in religious nonsense. They called him a fraud, a yellow belly. Worse, his commanding officers tried everything to get him to quit. They denied him passes. They assigned him the worst details. They mocked his faith openly. His fellow soldiers were no better. They beat him. They hazed him. They threw boots at him while he prayed beside his bunk at night. One soldier told him flat out, "You're gonna get us all killed, Doss. And when you do, I hope it's you first." His captain, Jack Glover, couldn't stand the sight of him. Here was a man who seemed to embody everything a soldier shouldn't be. Weak, stubborn, naive. Glover tried to have Doss discharged on psychiatric grounds. He called him mentally unfit, a liability, a danger to the entire company. But Desmond wouldn't break. He endured the abuse. He passed every physical test. He excelled at first aid training. He could apply a tourniquet faster than anyone in the battalion. He knew every bone in the human body, every pressure point, every technique for treating shock and trauma. And when they tried to court-martial him for refusing to carry a weapon, a quirk of military law saved him. The regulations allowed for non-combatant service. Desmond had found a loophole, not to avoid war, but to serve in it on his own terms. Reluctantly, bitterly, the army let him stay, but they didn't trust him, and they certainly didn't respect him. By early 1945, the 77th Infantry Division had seen brutal combat across the Pacific. Guam, Leyte, the Philippines. Islands whose names most Americans had never heard of, now written in blood. Desmond had been there for all of it, and something strange had happened. The men who once despised him had started to see him differently. Under fire, Desmond didn't cower. He ran toward danger. When bullets flew and mortars screamed, when other men pressed themselves into the mud praying for survival, Desmond moved through the chaos with an almost supernatural calm. He dragged wounded men from the line of fire. He bandaged sucking chest wounds while machine gun rounds snapped overhead. He whispered prayers as he worked, and somehow, impossibly, he didn't get hit. The soldiers began to notice. They began to talk. Doss seemed protected, lucky, maybe even blessed. They started requesting him. They wanted Desmond Doss with them when they went into combat, because if you got hit, you knew he'd come for you, no matter what. But nothing they'd faced before compared to Okinawa. The Japanese High Command had decided to make their stand here. This was the last major island before the Japanese home islands. Every cave, every ridge, every inch of coral rock had been turned into a fortress. The 77th Division's objective was a 400-foot escarpment on the island's western edge, Hacksaw Ridge. Intelligence reports said it was defended by the Japanese 62nd Division. battle-hardened troops who'd been preparing these positions for months. From above, Japanese forces had an unobstructed view of the American positions. Machine gun nests, artillery, mortars, interconnected tunnels that allowed soldiers to disappear and reappear like ghosts. The Japanese commander, Colonel Tsunetaro Nishi, had sworn his men would die before surrendering this ground. He meant it. The assault began on April 29th. Desmond's unit, Company B of the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment, climbed cargo nets up the sheer cliff face in the pre-dawn darkness, feet slipping on wet rope. Hideous hands bleeding, the sound of their breathing loud in their own ears. They knew what waited at the top. Every man climbing that cliff understood the odds. This wasn't like the beaches. There was no room to maneuver, no flanking positions, no way to call in naval support effectively. The Japanese owned the high ground. And in war, the high ground is everything. When the first men crested the ridge, the world exploded. Machine gun fire tore through the ranks. Mortars rained down. Men fell screaming, tumbling back down the cliff or collapsing where they stood. The Americans pushed forward anyway. They had to take this ridge. Orders from General Andrew Bruce himself. The attack turned into a bloodbath within minutes. Desmond moved through it all, morphine syrettes in his pockets, bandages slung across his chest. Was sulfa powder to fight infection. No weapon, just his faith and his medical bag. The first man he reached had been hit in the stomach, intestines exposed, a wound that should have been fatal. Desmond packed the wound, administered morphine, whispered, "You're gonna be okay, buddy. Stay with me." He dragged the soldier to cover behind a coral outcropping, then went back. Again and again. The ridge was a nightmare. Bodies everywhere. Some wounded, some dead, some dying. Some so torn apart you couldn't tell what parts belonged to which man. The screams were constant, a chorus of agony that never stopped. The air stank of cordite and blood and shit and death. The smell got into everything, your clothes, your skin, your lungs. You couldn't escape it. Desmond kept moving. A corporal from Brooklyn had been hit by shrapnel, and his leg nearly severed at the knee. He was screaming, thrashing, going into shock. Desmond pinned him down, tied off the leg with a tourniquet made from a rifle sling, shot him full of morphine. "You're going home, soldier. You hear me? You're going home." The corporal's eyes focused on him, recognized him. "Doss? That you?" Desmond nodded. The corporal actually smiled through the pain. "I knew you'd come. I knew it." Desmond got him stabilized and moved to the next man, a lieutenant with his jaw blown off, drowning in his own blood. Desmond turned him on his side, cleared his airway, packed the wound. The lieutenant wouldn't survive, they both knew it, but Desmond stayed with him anyway, held his hand, prayed with him until the light went out of his eyes. By midday, the American position was crumbling. Seemed they'd gained a foothold on the ridge but couldn't advance. The Japanese defenders were too well entrenched, too determined, too willing to die. Casualties were catastrophic. Nearly half of Company B was down. The order came down from Captain Glover: withdraw, pull back, regroup, live to fight another day. The able-bodied soldiers began retreating down the cargo nets. They moved quickly, efficiently, the way trained soldiers do. But dozens of wounded men remained on top of the ridge. Too hurt to move. Too exposed to survive the night. If they were left behind, the Japanese would finish them. Everyone knew it. The Japanese didn't take prisoners on Okinawa. They couldn't afford to. Captain Glover looked around, doing the math in his head. There was no time, no way to get them all down. The wounded would slow the retreat. They'd have to leave them. Standard operating procedure in an impossible situation. That's when Desmond Doss refused to go. While everyone else climbed down the cliff, Desmond stayed on top. Alone. The ridge was now no man's land. Japanese soldiers controlled most of it. American artillery was about to begin shelling it. Desmond had minutes, maybe less. He crawled to the nearest wounded man, a private with a shattered leg and a chunk missing from his shoulder. The private looked at him with eyes full of terror. "Don't leave me, Doss. Please don't leave me." Desmond tied a bowline knot around the soldier's chest using a rope he'd found, then dragged him to the edge of the cliff. He'd devised a system in his head, a double-loop rope harness. He'd lower each man down the cliff face hand over hand, using the rope wrapped around a tree stump as an anchor point. 40 feet of rope, 400 feet of cliff. Physics said it shouldn't work. Physics said the rope would snap or his hands would give out or he'd lose his grip and send men plummeting to their deaths. Desmond didn't care about physics. He cared about the men bleeding out around him. Over and over. One man at a time. He lowered the first soldier, arms burning, hands already raw, then went back for another. A sergeant with a sucking chest wound, bubbles of blood forming on his lips with each breath. Desmond sealed the wound with petroleum jelly and a wrapper from a ration pack, the field expedient method every medic knew, then rigged the harness and lowered him down. A corporal missing half his face, but somehow still alive, still conscious, still aware. Desmond talked to him the whole time, kept him calm, kept him focused on anything but the pain. Lowered him down, went back, found another, and another. Desmond didn't think about the odds. Didn't think about the Japanese soldiers who could appear at any second. He prayed, the same prayer, again and again. Lord, please help me get one more, just one more. He'd get a man to the edge, rig the harness, lower him down, 40 feet of rope paying out through bleeding hands. Then he'd pray again, one more, please Lord, one more. The Japanese didn't understand what they were seeing. Through the smoke and fading light, they could see movement on the cliff edge. One man, alone, unarmed, moving like a ghost through the carnage, hauling bodies, working with methodical determination. Some Japanese soldiers shot at him. Rounds kicked up dirt at his feet, pinged off rocks inches from his head. One bullet tore through his jacket without hitting flesh, passed so close he felt the heat of it. Desmond barely noticed. He just kept working, kept praying, kept lowering men down. The Americans at the base of the cliff couldn't believe it either. Wounded soldiers kept appearing at the cliff edge, suspended by ropes, descending like angels through the smoke. And at the top, visible in brief glimpses, was Doss. Still moving, still alive, still refusing to quit. Night fell. Desmond worked by feel now. The darkness was nearly total, broken only by the occasional flare or explosion. He could hear Japanese voices close by, could hear them moving through the rocks, searching for survivors to kill. He crawled on his belly from wounded man to wounded man, using their moans to find them in the dark. Some were unconscious, some were delirious with pain and shock. Some begged him to leave them, to save himself, told him it was hopeless. He ignored them, tied the rope around their chests, lowered them down into the void, trusting that American hands waited below to receive them, prayed for one more. His hands were shredded. The rope had cut through his palms to the bone, flayed the skin from his fingers. Blood made the rope slippery, made it hard to grip. Twice it nearly slipped from his grasp. If it had, the man on the other end would have fallen 400 feet to his death. Desmond held on, tightened his grip, ignored the pain. His shoulders screamed. His back was on fire. He'd been working for over 12 hours without food or water, without rest, without stopping. He kept going. Would a young private, couldn't have been more than 18, had been hit in both legs and the chest. He was crying, calling for his mother. Desmond held him, whispered to him, "You're gonna see her again, son. I promise. You're gonna go home." He rigged the harness, extra careful because of the chest wound, and lowered him down. The private's blood soaked into Desmond's uniform, warm and sticky. Desmond whispered a prayer for him, then turned to find the next man. A sergeant he recognized, a man who'd been one of the worst tormentors during basic training. The sergeant looked up at him with recognition and shame. "I'm sorry, Doss. I'm so sorry for what we did to you." Desmond shook his head. "Doesn't matter now. Let's get you home." He lowered him down, went back for more. Sometime after midnight, he lowered the last man he could find. He'd lost count of how many. 50? 60? More? His mind was fog. His body was running on pure willpower and prayer. The ridge was finally quiet. The wounded were gone. The dead remained, but there was nothing Desmond could do for them now. They were in God's hands. He crawled to the cliff edge and began his own descent. Hand under hand, the rope slick with his own blood, feet searching for purchase on the slick rock face. Halfway down, his strength gave out. His hands wouldn't grip anymore. The muscles simply stopped responding. He hung there in the darkness, suspended between earth and sky, and for the first time all day, he thought he might die. His fingers started to slip. The rope began sliding through his palms. Then hands grabbed him from below. American soldiers hauling him down the last section of cliff. They'd been watching, Alice waiting, praying for him. They carried him away from the base of the ridge. Someone put a canteen to his lips. Someone else bandaged his hands as best they could. Desmond could barely speak. His throat was raw from smoke and screaming instructions. He'd done what he came to do. The men were safe. At dawn, Captain Glover ordered a head count of the wounded who'd been evacuated from Hacksaw Ridge. The number kept climbing. 50 men. 60. 70. 75. 75 soldiers who would have died on that ridge if they'd been left behind. All saved by one man. The man Glover had once tried to discharge. The man they'd all called crazy. the man who wouldn't carry a gun. Glover stood there looking at the list of names, reading them one by one, and something broke inside him. Each name was a life, a story, a family waiting back home. Each one saved by Desmond Doss. Glover found Desmond in the aid station getting his hands treated. Doss's hands were wrapped in gauze, already seeping through with blood. His face was hollow with exhaustion, streaked with dirt and blood. His eyes had that 1,000-yard stare that comes from seeing too much death. Glover didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, this hard-bitten infantry captain who'd seen it all, and he couldn't find words. Then quietly, his voice breaking, he spoke. "I'm sorry, Doss. I was wrong about you. We were all wrong. What you did up there, I've never seen anything like it. I'll never see anything like it again." But Hacksaw Ridge wasn't finished with Desmond Doss. 2 weeks later, on May 21st, the 77th Division launched another assault on the same ground. They needed to take the ridge permanently, and to secure it once and for all. Desmond went up with them. His hands were still bandaged. The doctors had told him to stay back, to rest, to let them heal. He refused. His men were going up. He was going with them. The fighting was even worse this time. The Japanese had reinforced during the brief lull. They'd brought up more ammunition, more troops, more artillery. They were desperate now. They knew the war was ending. They knew Okinawa was the last stand. They intended to take as many Americans with them as possible. The code of Bushido demanded it. Death before dishonor. Victory or annihilation. Desmond was treating a wounded man, a kid from Ohio with a sucking chest wound, when he saw the grenade. It came tumbling through the air, a small dark sphere against the smoke-filled sky. Time seemed to slow. The grenade landed 2 feet from where Desmond knelt. 2 feet from the wounded soldier. Desmond could have run. His reflexes were good. He had time to dive for cover, to save himself. Instead, he kicked the grenade away with his boot, sending it bouncing across the coral. Then he threw himself over the wounded soldier's body, shielding him with his own flesh. The grenade detonated. The blast was deafening. Shrapnel tore into Desmond's legs and side, 17 pieces of hot metal shredding through flesh and muscle. The pain was blinding, beyond anything he'd ever experienced. Catastrophic. His left leg was shredded from knee to ankle. His right leg wasn't much better. Blood poured from a dozen wounds. Desmond passed out. When he came to, he was being carried on a stretcher by 4 men moving toward the aid station at the base of the ridge. They were taking fire. Heavy fire. Japanese machine guns had the path zeroed in. The stretcher bearers had to drop him and take cover behind rocks. Desmond lay there on the stretcher, unable to move, rounds snapping overhead, kicking up geysers of dirt around him. He could see the fear in the stretcher bearers' eyes. They wanted to help him, but moving meant death. Desmond understood. He didn't blame them. Then he saw another soldier nearby, wounded worse than he was. A kid, maybe 19, blonde hair matted with blood. The kid had been hit in the femoral artery. Blood was pumping out with each heartbeat. He had minutes to live, maybe less. Desmond rolled off his own stretcher. The pain when he hit the ground was indescribable. His vision went white. He thought he might pass out again. He didn't. He crawled to the kid. Each movement sent fresh waves of agony through his shattered legs. He reached the soldier, found the wound, applied pressure. His hands were still bandaged, still healing, but he made them work. He found his medical bag, somehow still attached to his belt, applied a tourniquet with hands that shook from pain and blood loss, tightened it until the bleeding stopped, stayed with the kid, talking to him, keeping him conscious until the stretcher bearers could reach them both. Only then did he allow himself to be evacuated. On the way down the ridge, a Japanese sniper's bullet found him. The round shattered his left arm between the elbow and shoulder, splintering the bone. Desmond didn't scream, didn't make a sound. He'd endured worse in the last hour. He'd seen worse. He just wanted to get off this godforsaken ridge. Wanted to make sure his men got home. The stretcher bearers moved faster now, running through the fire, determined to save the man who'd saved so many of them. They got him to the aid station. The doctors took one look at him and started shaking their heads. Too much damage, too much blood loss. They didn't think he'd make it through the night. Desmond proved them wrong. Again. Desmond Doss spent the next 5 years in and out of military hospitals. Walter Reed. Army hospitals in Virginia and Georgia. The wounds to his legs healed slowly, required multiple surgeries, left him with a permanent limp. His arm required 8 operations and never fully recovered. He lost most of the use of it. Then, in 1946, while recovering at a veterans hospital, he contracted tuberculosis from another patient. The TB attacked his lungs viciously. The doctors had to remove 1 entire lung and 5 ribs to stop the spread. The surgeries left him weak, chronically short of breath. The doctors told him he'd never work again, never live a normal life, told him he was lucky to be alive. Desmond didn't complain, never complained, not once. He'd done what he set out to do. He'd served his country without compromising his faith. He'd proved that you didn't need a weapon to be a warrior. That true courage wasn't about killing, it was about saving. It was about sacrifice. It was about loving your fellow man enough to die for him. On October 12, 1945, President Harry Truman stood in the White House East Room and placed the Medal of Honor around Desmond Doss's neck. He was the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the nation's highest military decoration. The room was full of dignitaries, generals, reporters, photographers. Desmond stood there in his dress uniform, still weak from his wounds, still in pain, uncomfortable with all the attention. Truman shook his hand, looked him in the eye, and said, "I'm proud of you, son. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." The citation was read aloud. It detailed his actions on Hacksaw Ridge, his refusal to leave the wounded, his superhuman effort to save 75 men. But the citation couldn't capture what it was really like. The terror, the pain, the constant presence of death. The moment-by-moment decision to keep going when everything in you screamed to stop. The men of the 77th Infantry Division. The same men who'd once beaten him and mocked him and called him a coward, they told a different story. They said Desmond Doss was the bravest man they'd ever seen, that he'd saved their lives, that he'd restored their faith in humanity in the middle of the most inhumane war ever fought. They said when you were lying on that ridge, bleeding and scared and certain you were going to die, and you saw Desmond crawling toward you through the fire, you knew you had a chance. Because he wouldn't leave you, no matter what. He'd made a promise, not just to God, but to every man who wore the uniform. He would save lives, and he did. 75 men in one night. Countless others before and after. Each one a father, a son, a brother, a husband. Each one returned to the people who loved them because a man they'd called crazy decided that faith was stronger than fear. Desmond Doss returned to Lynchburg, Virginia after the war. He married his sweetheart, Dorothy Schutte, the girl who'd waited for him through all those years of combat in hospitals. They raised a son together, Desmond Jr., in a small house on a quiet street. Desmond worked as a carpenter when his health allowed, though the pain never really left him. He never sought fame or recognition, never talked much about what he'd done. When people asked him how he did it, how he saved all those men, he'd give the same answer every time. "I was just doing my job. And I prayed a lot. I prayed, 'Lord, please help me get one more. Just one more.' And he did. Over and over. He helped me get one more." Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors in the National Cemetery in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Hundreds attended the funeral. Veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, family members, people whose lives he'd touched. The flag-draped coffin was carried by soldiers from the 77th Infantry Division, men who'd served decades after Desmond but who knew his story, who'd been inspired by his example. They lowered him into the ground as a bugler played taps, and as the final note faded across the hills, those who knew him best understood a simple truth. Desmond Doss had never fired a weapon in his life, but he'd fought harder than almost anyone. He'd faced down impossible odds armed with nothing but faith, a medic's bag, and an unshakable conviction that every human life was sacred. They'd called him crazy, called him a coward, called him a fool. They were wrong about all of it. He was a hero. The truest kind. The kind that saves instead of destroys. The kind that builds instead of tears down. The kind that proves love is stronger than hate, even in hell itself.